Good. Well, first off, I want to thank Mike for inviting me here. It's always been a real treat and been important to me intellectually to have the chance to hang out with lawyers and scholars from other disciplines. My friend and neighbor Larry Kramer said this to me, I don't know, some months ago, that maybe one reason I've enjoyed some success in this field is I try to take the lawyer's arguments seriously and then try to ask what can historians contribute to them. So it's really valuable to me just to sit here and to get a sense of what's being argued. So with Chris's paper, I want to start by saying, which I think he's already alluded to, the paper's a bit rough, came in a bit late. It needs a good editing, and I think more important, I think the core arguments wait a long time to appear, and probably get rid of the first 20 pages, and we wouldn't really, in all honesty, we probably wouldn't really lose that much. Because the core argument, because he goes over fairly familiar and I think non-controversial issues there, and I think the real gist only starts appearing, once you get into the 20s. So I'm going to confine my remarks to that point. A second point I wanted to make by way of introduction, when I come to events like this, it makes me aware, A, of how vast the literature on originalism is, which I'm never going to try to keep up with because life is short and I have other priorities. But it's also a reminder of, well, no, it's true. But it's also, it's also a reminder that there are multiple disciplines, and there are, a number of people who work in this field. I think they don't always know about each other. For example, I had not known that the removal debate of 1789, which I did write about in the last chapter of Original Meanings, is now known as the Decision of 1789. This is news to me that it actually has its own title. And I think more important than that, though, for the benefit of you guys, of the lawyers present, is I think that the subject of Chris's paper, or the larger subject of the unitary executive, is going to be affected by, pretty eminently by the publication of at least one book the other Jack and I have spoken about, and that's Eric Nelson's book, Patriot Royalists. So Eric, I don't know how many of you guys know his work. Eric's a young political theorist, but young and extremely ambitious political theorist at Harvard. He has one very good book on the Greek versus Republican traditions and Republican thinking, and another book called The Hebrew Republic, which deals with the way in which notions of the Jews' acceptance of kingship have a major impact on 16th century political scholarship. His new book, Patriot Royalists, is essentially an argument about the development and evolution of American ideas about executive power. The key part of this argument is to say that a problem that stumped a lot of people, including myself, which is why are the Americans so attached to George III in 1774 and a bit into 1775? Where does that argument come from? A lot of us, I think myself included, saw this as kind of a strategic argument the Americans want to make to try to get the government to put limits on Parliament. But what Eric does is to develop a very complicated, very richly informed story about how deeply this reaches into Americans' understanding of really of early 17th century English history. So it's, the upshot of this, actually, James Wilson is one of the main heroes of his story when he works his way around the Constitutional Convention. So that would be important. On the other hand, to deal with Chris's central thesis, I have another colleague, Ray Rafael, who hangs out in Mendocino, so I'm not always sure, where he is. Where's Randy? This will be of interest to Randy with your interest in medical marijuana. But Ray has an interesting book called Mr. President, which came out 2 years ago, and actually he makes a very powerful argument that it's not Wilson but Governor, and it is, by the way, Governor Morris. And I know this because we have a Governor Morris descendant retired on the Stanford faculty. So that's authoritative. So it's actually Governor Morris who was arguably the leading architect of the presidency. The reason for this is the presidency in its final form comes out of what Chris calls the Committee of 11, but I prefer the Committee on Postponed Parts that meets in late August, early September. It's its report of September 4th, which lays out the presidency. Morris is on that committee. Wilson is still on the Committee of Detail. And Ray makes a pretty good argument. And also Madison's on that committee, and according to John Dickinson's recollection, Madison actually plays a critical role in drafting, although this is ex post, so I'm a little nervous about it, but Madison played a critical role in drafting the final part of this. So there's a more complicated story here about which of these guys was most important. So that's a bit of bibliography. Let me go on and say something pretty quickly about the paper. It seems to me that essentially Chris makes two sets of claims. One is about Wilson's role in shaping the unitary presidency. I want to do this very quickly. The first part of the paper, I think he deals with the point that's now fairly non-controversial. That's the notion of accountability. I think most of us agree that the idea of a unitary presidency is closely tied to the idea. You want to have some final, finite, ultimate source of accountability who you can really hold responsible and then go about impeaching if that's your, if that's your desire. Second argument, but I think that's fine, but I don't think there's much news there. Second point I think deserves more treatment than it gets, and that's Wilson's critical role in saying, what do we mean by executive power? This comes out, I think, in the debates of June 1st, 1787, only a few days into the convention, where Wilson takes issue with whether or not the prerogative powers of the British Crown, particularly the power of war and diplomacy, are those parts of the prerogative, part of a Republican conception of executive power. At this point, I think very interesting to me is in my capacity as a Madisonian, is that Madison, who I think Chris quite correctly says, Madison did not think deeply about executive power. It's always at the back of his list. I think he starts worrying about executive power not really until 1793. And a major part of my argument is Madison, down to 1793, is dominated by his fear of the impetuous vortex of the legislature, particularly the lower house, and it's only when he sees the implications of, in the Washington's second term of executive power, that he starts rethinking that formula. Anyhow, that treatment doesn't get, that issue, which I think is critical, doesn't get much treatment here. So that, whereas then I think in the end, Chris, I think the point you emphasize about the question of the advisory council is not that big a deal either. So Wilson does change courses towards the end of the convention, but the essential story there is that, the Committee on Postponed Parts, revises the relationship between President and Senate, and the idea here is the President will be the tool of the Senate if the Senate's going to, until they come up with the idea that the House will be the contingent elector if the Electoral College fails to produce a majority. So I think Wilson, when he makes that remark, is trying to come up with a reaction against the idea that there's a strong tie between the President and the Senate. He wants to give the President some auxiliary source of advisory authority. So it's an interesting point. I don't think it's that critical. For me, the most interesting parts of this, I think, have to do with the discussion of how you think about Wilson and Madison in conjunction with one another, and with the argument you want to make about separation of powers versus mixed government. So here, I guess I would want to, and here I think I have some pretty substantial criticisms, on the merits. So I just don't agree with the number of your claims, and that's fine. We all have the same First Amendment rights, even in this realm. But you might want to think about some of these things. For starters, I think Wilson and Madison agree on a lot of things. I think they're pretty close. I think they're pretty close on. Once you put that question about interest in the executive, as I said, to the side, there are a lot of things they agree about pretty closely. Initially, they're very close on the election of the Senate. On June 7th, which is the critical day when the convention discusses how will the Senate be elected, it's Wilson and Madison who argue, I think effectively together, that you need some mechanism other than the state legislatures. As Madison says, anything but the state legislatures will be the best way to do this, and they lose that decisively. But the point is, they are really collaborating pretty closely on that issue. And of course, that's a momentous issue because they lose so badly, even though there's further discussions in the convention. And by the way, it's by no means clear that every state would have been represented in the Senate. When you look at Madison's notion of proportionality, it's this kind of really gray and difficult area, but that's one implication. But in any case, they work pretty closely on that issue. They share the idea, and you note this in passing, but you don't give it the emphasis it deserves. They share that idea about the filtration of talent, maybe not in the Senate, but at least as it relates to the scheme of having large districts for electing members of the House. I mean, they both seem to agree that the advantage of having a large district is somehow, the local demagogues, the kind of guys I knew from Cook County or whatever, that they'll knock each other out, and the more talented guys will rise. So they're pretty close to that. And I think most important, they're really close on the Council of Revision. And Madison Wilson, I think, kind of flip off. Not flip off. They kind of alternate in the two significant debates there. But they both make essentially the same arguments. They are both concerned with improving the quality of legislative deliberation, with preventing impulsive lawmakers from framing laws that will not be devised with an adequate amount of careful consideration. So for starters, I don't know, it seems to me on a lot of issues, these guys are allies, and differentiating them is tough. So that's the first point I want to make here. The second point I want to make has to do with the argument, I think it's pages 24 to 29 or 50, but the argument about mixed government versus separation of powers. Here I want to talk mostly as a Madisonian and not as a Wilsonian. Of course, so I think I think Madison was deeply critical, almost dismissive, of the ideas about separation of powers as they had been received by the Americans, with the influence of Montesquieu being deep behind that. He kind of says this famous in Federalist 37, questions daily arise in practice which proves the obscurity which reigns in this area and which puzzle the greatest adepts in political science. I think Madison was extremely pragmatic in terms of thinking about separation of powers. He didn't like the way in which Americans were hung up on the formula that you find in a couple of the state constitutions, including, I think, Pennsylvania's. Maybe I'm wrong about this, where one shall not occupy the powers of the other two, and you repeat that 3 times. That's what Madison meant by a parchment barrier. That's going to be totally inefficacious. What you want to come up with is some workable set of arrangements. Now, in your paper, though, what Chris suggests, and what I have a real problem with, is the idea that makes Madison somehow into a fan of mixed government. I don't think so. Or as I like to tell my students, quoting Borat, nish. Madison thought John Adams rightly was a big fan of mixed government, and criticized him pretty badly. I think Madison is struggling towards a different kind of model. I don't think, with a couple qualifications, I don't think he sees the Senate as an institution designed to protect interests of class. And here in the paper, as in your oral remarks, you suggest that class is the kind of dominating animus here. I don't think Madison's thinking in those terms. I think he is thinking about interests in a more complex, proto-modern way. There's a great illustration of this in Federalist 10, right after the paragraph on faction, which in fact is germane to the separation of powers theory, where Madison says, what are legislative acts, but so many judicial determinations, not indeed concerning the rights of individuals, but concerning the rights of parties. And then he goes on to discuss parties. He has a very expansive notion there about the interplay between economic interests broadly distributed in the society and the kind of politics that legislators will draw. So what I think Madison was working on, I mean, it's true, as you say, but only partly true, that he did see the Senate. I think Madison struggles with this after the convention because he wasn't very happy with the way the Senate came out. I mean, I think it's true, and he says this in Federal 62, 63, he tries to hold on to the conception of the Senate in the way in which he'd thought about it since at least 1785, where he said, well, the problem with the American Constitution is we need a source of wisdom and stability. And the best way to do this is to have an upper house. But the upper house we got, even before the current mischief reigning there, was not the one he wanted. So I think that part. I think that part needs. You want me to wrap up, or how am I doing? Yeah. Okay. So I think just say so in so many words. So I think I think that part needs a lot of work. I think Madison was much more concerned with how do you turn the Senate into a deliberative institution that would take the time to do the work it did. And that leads me, I think, just to one last point I want to make here, which I think actually ties in with some other things more generally. There's no account in the paper, and I think in discussions of unitary presidency, the convention is preoccupied with the notion of how do you elect the president. All right? That's when they debate the executive. The issue that they spend 90% of their time on is cycling around between popular election, legislative election, the idea of an electoral college. And they resolve this only at the very end. And when they resolve it, I think they take the least unsatisfactory, not the alternative they like, they take the least unsatisfactory alternative. But I think their preoccupation with the politics of how executive power will be constituted in terms of its relationship to the electorate remains a very complicated story, and it's one that really has not worked out. I was arguably maybe until you get to the 1820s and 1830s, which is why the earlier books by historians, Richard McCormick's book and Ralph Ketchum's book about the presidency from 1789 to about 1832, I think remain really instrumental. Of course, if you think of those terms, which I do as a political historian, then the whole originalist enterprise becomes even more problematic, because the real meaning of executive power has to be, to some significant extent, a function of a whole set of political contingencies that you need a way to account for. If I went over, I'm sorry. Thanks a lot.